So now we're going to go through chapter 5, part 1 of The Great Gatsby. So he comes back to his house that evening that Jordan has told him about the whole story about Daisy and Gatsby. And the whole Gatsby's not entertaining anybody, but his whole house, all the lights are on, right? Lit from tower to cellar, okay? So imagine this giant house with all the lights on, especially, like, obviously it costs a fortune. This is in a day when electricity wasn't necessarily a norm for absolutely everybody, and it cost a lot of money. So he thought at first it's a party or some kind of a game that's going on, but there was nothing going on. The house is empty, but all the lights are on. It's as if Gatsby wants the house to be noticed. And so he sees as he gets out of the taxi, he sees Gatsby walking towards him, and he tells Gatsby, "Your place looks like a fair. You know, it's like and he says, I've just been looking into some of the rooms." And then he offers Nick, "Let's go to Coney Island. Coney Island is a place where like for entertainment and getting a bite to eat. It's a nice place to go." But Nick says it's too late, and then he says, "Well, maybe we take a plunge in the swimming pool." It seems that Gatsby's looking for company. He's like a little bit lonely. And Nick just says that he's got to go to bed. He turns him down for all his invitations. And then he tells Gatsby that he's spoken to Jordan Baker, and that he's going to invite Daisy over to his house for tea. And Gatsby's very nice about it. He says, "I didn't want to put you into any trouble." And Nick says, "What day is good for you?" And he says, "No, what day is good for you?" So then they decide the day after tomorrow. Gatsby says he wants to get the grass cut, and Nick realizes he's not talking about the grass in his garden, because the grass in his garden is very well looked after. He's talking about the grass in Nick's garden. And then he says, does something kind of strange. Well, it's not really strange. We understand it, but it makes us wonder who Gatsby really is. He offers Nick some work, right? He says, "I carry on a little business on the side, a sort of sideline," and he realizes that Nick probably doesn't make that much money selling bonds at the moment. So he says, "Maybe you want to pick up a nice bit of money." And then he says, "It happens to be a rather confidential sort of thing." Confidential could mean something that is not 100% kosher. Okay, something that you don't talk about. He's offering him a way of making money, which is not a very legal way. He basically says no. He says he can't take on any more work. Nick turns him down, and Gatsby reassures him, says, "Oh, you don't have to do any business with Wolfsheim," because he guesses that Nick isn't very keen on his business partner Wolfsheim. But he says, "No, that's not the problem." But he doesn't really respond properly. But basically, the bottom line is that Nick has turned Gatsby down. So Nick leaves wondering why all the lights are still on in Gatsby's house. He calls up Daisy. The next day invites her to come to tea, tells her not to bring Tom. And she jokes and says, "Who's Tom?" So the day that they agreed upon, it's raining. And at 11 o'clock in the morning, a man comes over knocks on the door and says he's going to cut his grass. Gatsby is setting the scene. He's getting everything ready so that he can make the best impression possible on Daisy. And Nick does his preparations. He gets his Finnish housewife to buy the food, and he sends her to buy flowers, but he says the flowers are unnecessary because at 2 o'clock, Gatsby comes. It says a greenhouse arrived from Gatsby's, meaning a huge number of flowers. It's not actually literally a greenhouse. So basically Gatsby's really making a big effort here. And then an hour later, Gatsby comes and he's dressed very elegantly with a white flannel suit. Flannel is a very nice fabric. He has a silver shirt and a gold-coloured tie. But Gatsby doesn't look great. He's pale and there are dark signs of sleeplessness beneath his eyes. Gatsby is obviously very nervous about this encounter with Daisy. He says, is everything all right? He says, and Nick says the grass is fine, and he's like, Gatsby's completely forgotten about the grass. He's forgotten about everything. He's even looked up in the papers to see when the rain would stop, and he makes sure that the Nick has everything that he should have with the tea. And Nick has bought cakes, and Gatsby approves. So Gatsby kind of hangs around. Meantime, the rain lifts as just a mist. He's kind of pretending to occupy himself reading something, but he's not really reading anything at all. And then at some point he says, "I'm going home." And Nick says, "Why?" He says, "Nobody's coming to tea. It's too late." He says, "I can't wait around all day." But it's actually before the time that Daisy's supposed to come. So he sits down. And then we hear the sound of the car, and everybody gets very, very nervous. Daisy has arrived. She's wearing this beautiful lavender hat, and the description of her is very positive. Looked at me with a bright, ecstatic smile. She says, "This is absolutely where you live, my dearest one." Like, she's very warm. And it says, "The exhilarating ripple of her voice was a wild tonic in the rain. I had to follow the sound of it for a moment up and down with my ear alone before any words came through." There's something very magical about her, that she really draws Nick in. Like a damp streak of hair lay like a dash of blue paint across her cheek. She flirts with Nick. She says, "Oh, are you in love with me? Is that why I had to come alone?" And Nick says, "No, that's a secret. Tell your chauffeur to go away and spend an hour." So she sends a chauffeur away, and they go. She takes her into the living room. He takes her into the living room, and the living room's empty, which is very strange because he was expecting Gatsby to be there. But Gatsby has gone. He really is setting this thing up as a scene, because he has actually gone out and come back in as if he's arriving afterwards, because he wants to make an entrance, because there's a knocking at the door and Gatsby's standing there. And he stalks past him, and Nick is now getting just as nervous as Gatsby, I think, about this whole thing. And then he goes into the room, and then Gatsby and Daisy are reunited for the first time in 5 years. So things are very, very awkward at first. There's like a big gaps in the conversation, but it does seem that Daisy is very happy to see him. But he's like so nervous that he leans on this clock and breaks the clock, which is very interesting because what does a clock represent? A clock represents time, the passing of time, and it's that Gatsby so desperately wants to deny the passing of time in the fact that he's spent these past 5 years keeping the vision of Daisy alive and living in this dream that he'll get her back, and that he can recreate what happened in the past. So the clock is really quite a big metaphor for what's going on. And Nick says, "Oh well, it's an old clock," I told them idiotically, and Daisy says, "We haven't met for many years." And Gatsby knows exactly how many years. 5 years will be next November. And things continue to become very awkward, and then the tea comes. And it seems very much that Gatsby, even though he desperately wants to be with Daisy, he doesn't want Nick to leave. He needs Nick as part of this scene as well. And then Nick goes out, leaves the living room, and Gatsby follows him and says, "Oh, oh God, this is a terrible, terrible mistake." And Nick says, "Well, you're just embarrassed," and Daisy's embarrassed too. And Gatsby's like, "What? She's embarrassed?" And he tells Gatsby that he's acting like a little boy, which is really interesting because this is the shift from the Gatsby who was the one who held these incredible parties, and he's got this incredible reputation, and he's Mr. Successful, and all of a sudden he's like, he doesn't know where to put himself. So in the meantime, Nick goes off. He decides he has to leave Gatsby and Daisy alone. So he goes into the garden and he looks over at Gatsby's house, and we have a little bit of a background here. That a brewer, somebody who brewed beer, who was obviously a successful businessman, he had built it, and he wanted to. He was going to pay all the taxes on the neighbouring cottages if they agreed to have their roofs thatched with straw, because he wanted everything to have this certain look. Like, this is like the amount of money that goes on things that are so stupid, like changing people's roofs so that your house fits in with everything else. He wanted it to look like it was this old-fashioned house. So that was just a little bit of back information. But actually, he in the end he lost his money, and this is also very interesting because we understand how the comings and goings of things, how things in their time can be great and wonderful and amazing, but everything fades, everything disappears in the end, nothing stays the same. So half an hour passes. Nick sees a car with food arriving at Gatsby's house, probably for the servants' food, and there was a servant is moving through the house, and she's spitting into the garden. He's really just observing the house. Nick goes back into the house and he sees Gatsby and Daisy. Things have quietened down. Things are a bit calmer now, and they're sitting each on one side of the couch. But obviously something has gone on because Daisy's face is smeared with tears, and it looks like they've been in the middle of a deep conversation. So she's crying, and Gatsby, he's completely transformed. It says he literally glowed. Without a word or gesture of exaltation, a new well-being radiated from him and filled the room. So Gatsby has achieved his dream. He is happy. He has got Daisy now. They have become reunited. Nick tells him it stopped raining. And he says to her, "What do you think of it? It stopped raining." And she says, "I'm glad, Jay." And he says, her throat full of aching, grieving beauty told only her unexpected joy. So here we have, evidence that Daisy really is genuinely very happy to be with Gatsby. And Gatsby decides that he has to show Daisy and Nick his house. Nick says, "Are you sure you want me to come?" And Gatsby says, "Yes, absolutely, I want you to come." So they go off. Gatsby kind of makes a slip because he says it took me just 3 years to earn the money that bought it, but he'd actually told Nick that he'd inherited the money. So so Nick says, "I thought you inherited the money." He says, "I did, old sport, but I lost most of it in the big panic, the panic of the war, whatever that was." So this is kind of interesting. What type of business do you have to be in to be able to make that much money that quickly? Okay. Then Nick says, "What business was he in?" And he answers, "That's my affair." Like, none of your business, he says. And then he realises afterwards is not exactly how a good response that he made. It wasn't appropriate for him to say that. So now the reader and Nick and the reader are a little bit suspicious about how Gatsby comes into all this incredible money.